the horror genre became an apt place to examine these fears, and in the next episode I will discuss an evocative little slasher series about teenage bodies dying on the streets. The first instalment of the Nightmare franchise, A Nightmare on Elm Street, was written and directed by Wes Craven, a director who saw success in the exploitation film genre with The Last House on the Left and The Hills Have Eyes. With the central villain of the emblematic child murderer, maybe child predator, Freddy Krueger, each film tells the story of a group of teenagers living on the titular Elm Street, being pursued and brutally killed by Freddy in their dreams. The franchise has lasted for 25 years and is one of the most successful horror franchises of all time. A Nightmare on Elm Street is a central text both in the slasher and horror genre, and is an evocative example of how horror iconography can be adopted into the cultural zeitgeist, thus queering our expectations of the slasher as niche and underground, as well as queering the anticipated audience. This, as well as its financial success, easily cement it within the horror canon and demonstrates its importance as a work of cinema. Today's episode will be focusing on the second installment of the franchise, A Nightmare on Elm Street 2: Freddy's Revenge, or the gayest horror film ever made, and it'll operate as an analysis of the monstrous representation of gay panic and internalized homophobia within young men, as well as its placement of a deep queer subtext and homoerotic imagery within the midst of the 1980s AIDS epidemic. This episode will also be our first introduction to the final girl horror trope, and why gender bending the trope might effectively establish a means of queer coding a male protagonist. Let's start with Final Girls, since this will not be the last time you hear the term when it comes to horror theory. As part of her theory concerning the slasher genre, Carol Clover coined the term Final Girl to discuss the typically female survivor of the slasher film. The protagonist is seen as pure in the eyes of her pursuer, culturally prized, and therefore a worthy opponent in the climax of the film. She follows the rules of a slasher film. She doesn't drink, she does well at school, and she absolutely does not have sex. Whilst meta slashers would twist and break these rules, this being a querying in itself in texts like Scream, these were key traits of survival in the slasher film during the golden age of slasher. Nightmare on Elm Street initially had a female protagonist, Nancy Thompson, who was an effective final girl. She was well-behaved, strong-willed, and pure in the most simple definition. Nightmare 2 shifted this dynamic with a male protagonist, Jesse Walsh, who exhibited many of the same traits as Nancy, which effectively made him a final boy, which may be the reason Freddy is so obsessed with doggedly possessing him. Nightmare 2 queers the definition of the final girl, and similarly queers the established Nightmare canon by placing a queer-coded male in the place where a woman once stood. Indeed, instead of having a teenage girl in jeopardy, we have a bisexual male, and this factor is exploited by Freddy. And there's a lot to unpack about Jesse. Much of Jesse's queerness is indeed written in the text. When frightened by his nightmares, Jesse doesn't flee into the arms of his girlfriend, he seeks the comfort of his hunky male best friend Grady. Jesse's wardrobe for much of the film also leaves little for the imagination, since he spends most of the film in his underwear and is constantly dripping with sweat, objectified through a potentially gay lens. He also dances to 80s club music in his bedroom, thrusting his hips with the camera focused on his rear and a "No Chicks Allowed" sign displayed on his door. For all intents and purposes, Jesse is a queen, a flamboyant or effeminate gay man, and a scream queen at that. And boy, does this queen scream. As previously mentioned, much of the homosocial dynamics presented in Nightmare 2, particularly between Jesse and Grady, can be easily read as a kind of queer subtext. They spend much of their time together, often shirtless and sweaty after working out together, aligning with a rich history of gym culture and gay men. In their first scene, Grady wrestles Jesse to the ground and pulls his trousers down, to which Jesse responds by attempting to yank Grady's shirt off, aligning both boys with a desire that can only be expressed through violence. Typically, love and violence are ideas that should counter one another, but they become intricately connected through the context of the horror genre. This idea becomes especially evocative later in the film. When Jesse cannot perform sexually for his would-be girlfriend, professional Meryl Streep impersonator Lisa Weber, which is a common anxiety in closeted gay men, he runs into the arms of Grady, tearfully explaining,
"Something is trying to get inside my body."
To which Grady replies,
"Yeah, and she's female and she's waiting for you in the cabana. And you want to sleep with me."
There's a particular emphasis on the language getting inside for Jesse throughout the film, which can not only be an example of fear of gay sex, but also one towards internal disruptions of the body, exampled in early 30s horror. When Freddy finally possesses Jesse, Grady is his first kill. Dripping with sweat and half naked, Freddy grasps Grady by the throat with the camera focusing on Grady's gasping breast as if at the peak of climax, and penetrates him through the chest, killing Jesse's object of desire in a Freudian display of violence. This representation of male desire through violence is also replicated earlier in the film. The character of Coach Snyder is introduced to Jesse, with Grady stating he
hangs around queer S&M joints downtown. He likes pretty boys like you.
This quote alone places Nightmare 2's queer readings as text rather than just subtext, as well as somewhat validating Jesse's queer coding, pretty boy being a pretty explicit term for gay-coded males. Later in the film, Jesse meets Coach Snyder in one of these bars, and the two go back to the school's showers, aligning with the gym culture of gay males, which people often cite as a response to the AIDS crisis. Schneider is then attacked by Freddy before being dragged to the showers, tied up and stripped, and brutally flogged by towels before a slash to the back kills him. The two men pictured in the foggy shower room conjures up imagery of the gay bathhouse and sauna scene that took a dramatic financial hit after the AIDS crisis. Areas associated with sex, with love and tenderness, have now become associated with illness and violence, and indeed the scene in Nightmare 2 can be read in a similar way. A kind of haven for the two is reduced to a place of violence and death. Additionally, it could be read as an homage to Carrie, particularly when, after the death of Schneider, the showers spit blood on Jesse and he becomes soaked in it, much like Sissy Spacek in the climax of Carrie. Carrie now has an intimate relationship with gay viewers because of the film's relationship with themes of gender and sexual difference, and Nightmare 2 making a visual homage to Carrie aligns it with further queer readings. Jesse, caught between an adult embrace of sexuality and an infant's revolted fascination, voyeuristically watches in horror before looking down and seeing Freddy's iconic glove on his hand, to which he aptly screams in shock. Benshoff describes this scene as a metaphoric homosexual panic attack, where Jesse, being aroused by the possible sexual encounter with the coach, murders him rather than admit his homosexual feelings. Through both of these male killings, there's a number of different ways that Freddy can be read through the lens of a possession narrative. Typically associated with young girls such as Reagan in The Exorcist and M in The Possession, once again queering another horror narrative through the use of a male protagonist, Freddy is obsessed with possessing Jesse rather than killing him. Freddy's pursuit of his protagonists have often been positioned as that of a sexual predator, though it wouldn't be until the reboot that this was actually canon.
The reboot sucked!
But particularly in Nightmare 2, his obsession with getting inside Jesse can be read as a real sexual threat. However, Freddy's possession of Jesse can also be read as a metaphor for Jesse's own internalized homophobia, making his killings of Grady and Coach Snyder a pseudo-gay panic narrative. Appropriately put by Robert Englund himself, Freddy could represent the self-hatred in the gay community. Jesse cannot truly act on his gay feelings towards both men, and his sexual desire comes out in a brutal violence. Not only does this align with previously mentioned theory, as well as some discussions for later episodes, it also aligns with anxieties of the late 1980s. For example, these were the most active years of infamous gay serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer, and reports at the time were broadcasting brutalized gay male bodies. There became a nationwide association of gay males with brutal violence and death. And while this might be retrogressive, the cultural context of homosexuality in the 1980s is represented throughout the text and validates a queer reading of Nightmare 2. Nightmare 2 came out in 1986, during the midst of the AIDS crisis that swept over America, and the nationwide fear and paranoia that the disease invoked from the audience was quickly translated through the horror genre. The Fly depicted a genius scientist succumbing to a disease whose early manifestations of bodily change resembled the skin lesions of Kaposi's sarcoma that he potentially passed on to his girlfriend during sex. While Cronenberg hasn't agreed with The Fly as an AIDS allegory, he cites it as an in-general disease metaphor. Reading it through a queer lens ties it closely to a chronological trajectory of queer depiction on screen. Jesse himself displays some symptoms that one might associate with the AIDS disease. He wakes up sweating, he has trouble eating and sleeping, and he's constantly haunted with the idea that a disease inside of him is going to kill him and everyone he cares about. This would be an idea replicated in the behind the scenes of Nightmare 2. It is here I'd like to intervene with a discussion of authorial intention and its specific relevance to Nightmare 2 and queer horror. Authorial intent refers to the author's, that being director or screenwriter's, intent as it's encoded in the work, and is often used as a particular critical framework when a director or writer is a marginalised identity, e.g. Dracula and Bram Stoker's supposed gayness. While looking through a retroactive lens, Nightmare 2's queer subtext is quickly identified. This wasn't the case at the time of filming. In an interview, Nightmare 2's director Jack Shoulder said,
"I simply did not have the self-awareness to realize that any of this might be interpreted as gay."
Additionally, the crew was supposedly unaware of the gay subtext at the time of filming, and only acknowledge it retroactively.
But looking back, it was so gay. It was amazing.
However, this wouldn't be the case for Mark Patton and his experience with Nightmare 2 in the future. In an article with HIV+, Mark Patton states, after being asked to deny his sexuality in auditions following Nightmare 2, "All I could think of was how everyone I knew was dying from AIDS and we were having this bullshit conversation. My heart just broke, and that was the line for me." Patton's relationship with Nightmare 2 would prove to be tumultuous, particularly when he, an at the time closeted actor, would be blamed for the queer subtext of Nightmare 2 by David Chaskin, its writer. Chaskin has since admitted to writing a deliberate queer subtext in the script as a response to the rise of latent homophobia in the 1980s and his desire to encapsulate the fears and anxieties of the decade that came with it. Aligning with earlier discussions of authorial intent, Chaskin deliberately replicated a gay narrative through the text, thus it was aligned with a deliberate queerness. Knowing about this context, this reading also ties back to the fears of 1930s horror, the disrupted and developing body turning against the mind, forcing to come out. Jesse is not only fearful of a disease, he is fearful of his own queer body. Jesse, in fact, encapsulates the return of the repressed, a theory presented by Robin Wood. Wood draws comparisons to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, to which normality and monster are two aspects of the same person, in which Jekyll, the normative, has desires that only Hyde, the monster, can act on. This is particularly demonstrative through Nightmare 2 and the Jekyll and Hyde dynamic of Jesse and Freddy. Jesse is desirous of other men, and only Freddy can act on those desires, though the outcome, warped by the horror narrative, is violence, which presents two different readings of Jesse's possession, that of gay panic or of a brutalised homosexual desire. Joe Lipsett argues in favour of the gay panic reading, stating that when sexual situations arise that might naturally encourage Jesse to consider his unorthodox for the 80s sexuality, Freddy pops out. This echoes a fear gay men have called the gay panic defence, where the murder of gay men can be legally justified because of a temporary insanity at the hands of unwanted same-sex sexual advances. For example, Coach Snyder soliciting Jesse in the gay bar. The gay panic defence is still legal in 47 states across America and is effectively still a large fear that gay men have. By viewing gay panic as Nightmare 2's primary monster, we can read Freddy's possession of Jesse in killing men that he's attracted to through an explicitly queer lens, killing the objects of his desire, grading Coach Snyder, because he cannot truly be in love with them. However, Trace Thurman views Jesse's possession differently, citing Freddy as a physical representation of Jesse's queerness. He writes, "Freddy is a representative of Jesse's homosexuality. When Jesse is confronted with it, running into the coach at the BDSM bar, freaking out after kissing Lisa and running into Grady's arms, he/Freddy kills." Reading Jesse's killings of Grady and Schneider as instead representations of violent gay sex acts places Nightmare 2's queer subtext closer to the realms of the kind of homophobic representations of gay men the 1980s frequented. Indeed, the ending of this film would place this reading within the area of some textual validity too. The ending of Nightmare 2 sees Lisa confronting Freddy while expressing her love for Jesse, to which Freddy responds, "Jesse belongs to me now," suggesting more of a twisted love story than a possession narrative, which queers the audience expectations of the romantic heterosexual narrative. Lisa embraces Freddy and kisses him, this act being what gives Jesse the strength to overpower Freddy and save himself from his possession. Thurman reads this as the film essentially condemning homosexuality, since a heterosexual kiss is what saves Jesse from what could be interpreted as his queerness. However, it could be argued that this was a platonic act of love, this being the narrative that Mark Patton and Kim Myers themselves believe in. In an interview, Patton claimed that Nightmare 2 was subverting, or queering, the traditional and patriarchal Hollywood narrative of male saviour and female victim by giving us a female saviour and a male victim. In this sense, we can argue that even Nightmare 2's representation of heterosexuality queers traditional value systems, and the fact that it is often a female saviour at the end of each film, the slasher genre itself is involved with this queering of traditional Hollywood ending. Myers even follows the idea by playfully stating,
"Lisa and Jesse could have been sort of the Will and Grace of the horror genre,"
thus aligning Nightmare 2's representation of male-female partnerships with iconic queerness. A Nightmare on Elm Street 2 effectively demonstrates a queer narrative through its use of the queered final boy, and its representation of queer fear at the hands of internalized homophobia and the AIDS epidemic. Its existence as a queer text amidst a canonical slasher franchise validates further queer readings of slasher films in the future, and aligns it as an important and influential text on the future of queer horror. Following the popularity of franchise slasher films in the 1980s, the early 90s saw a period of horror that largely focused on straight-to-video franchise releases with fewer non-franchise titles gaining attention. With some exceptions, Misery, Silence of the Lambs and Candyman, most of the horror films on the market were doing poorly at the box office and being dismissed by critics. From this grew a desire for a fresh horror franchise that represented the new generation of audience members and horror fans. Says Tim Pone,
"The industry was ready for a big change, and that was provided by Scream in 1996.
Hello?
Hello, Sydney.
Hi Hi, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. I'm trying something a little new with the formatting of these episodes, so let me know what you think. Be sure to follow me on Twitter at VideoNasty, the same way it's spelled here, to see my hot takes on horror and random ramblings. Yeah, so have a great day, stay safe, and remember, stay spooky.